If you want, I could admit them while you do introductions, because I see them too.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, let's see if I can figure out how to do that.
Okay.
There we go. Yeah.
All right. Hello and welcome to the University of Alberta's Department of Sociology Speaker Series. My name is Ken Kane. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and the organizer of this year's Speaker Series event, which is co-sponsored by the University of Alberta Sustainability Council, the Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology, and the Department of Sociology. It's a great pleasure to introduce and welcome today's speaker, Dr. Kari Norgaard from the University of Oregon. Before we start, I'd like to first acknowledge the Indigenous land and territory upon which our university and city is built upon and benefits from. The University of Alberta is home to a diverse and welcoming community of over 1,000 Indigenous students from across the country, and Edmonton has the second largest Indigenous population of any city in Canada. We celebrate our Indigenous heritage, including the ancestral land on which our university is located today. To acknowledge the traditional territory is to recognize its longer history, reaching beyond colonization and the establishment of European colonies, as well as its significance for the Indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live upon this territory, and whose practices and spiritualities were tied to the land and continue to develop in relationship to the land and its other inhabitants today. And so we respectfully acknowledge that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and Métis nations of Alberta Region 4, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. The Department of Sociology is involved in a number of activities and programs that go beyond this land acknowledgement to apply and incorporate decolonization, reconciliation, and indigenization into our sociological work. The theme of our speaker series is the nature and the social, which broadly encompasses the many ways that the social sciences and humanities explore, understand, and challenge and practice the complex notion of nature. Today, Dr. Kari Norgaard from the University of Oregon will be speaking about her research with the Carrick tribe in Northern California entitled Salmon and Acorns Feed Our People, Nature, Colonialism, and the Responsibility to Revitalize Sociological Theory. Dr. Kari Norgaard is a non-Indigenous professor of sociology and environmental studies who lives and thinks in Kalapuya land at the University of Oregon. She has also worked as a consultant for the Carrick tribe on tribal environmental policy since 2003. Over the past 15 years, Dr. Norgaard has published and taught in the areas of environmental sociology, Indigenous environmental justice, gender and environment, race, and sociology of emotions. She's the author of Salmon and Acorns Feed Our People, Nature, Colonialism, and Social Action at Rutgers University Press in 2019, and Living in Denial, Climate Change, Emotions, and Everyday Life at MIT Press in 2011. She is the recipient of the Fred Buttle Distinguished Contribution Award, a Sociology of Emotions Recent Contribution Award, and the Pacific Sociological Association's Distinguished Practice Award. Dr. Norgaard chaired the American Sociological Association's Environmental Sociology section from 2018 to 2019. Her latest book, Salmon and Acorns Feed Our People, Nature, Colonialism, and Social Action, was a 2020 finalist for the C.W. Mills Award for the Society for the Study of Social Problems. So we'll have time for questions and discussion following Dr. Norgaard's talk. Kari has kindly agreed to allow us to record her talk, and soon afterwards, we'll post a link to this recording on our Department of Sociology website. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kari Norgaard to the University of Alberta and the Department of Sociology Speaker Series.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ken. I should say, before I say anything else, Ken has been incredibly gracious and patient. We first spoke about trying to do something so long ago. You know, it's a bad sign when someone's name is really, really familiar and you haven't met them yet. We've been corresponding about this. So I'm really honored to be here in this crazy, crazy world that we're in. And I really appreciate the work that you do and the work that you're happening through this speaker series, and definitely honored for the opportunity to be a little part of it. I would like to say as well, just a little bit more, I really appreciate, the theme of this what I want to talk about as a non-native sociologist has to do with the teaching and learning and commitments that I've had based on the people from whom I've been learning in the last 15 years or so, but specifically Karuk folks that you'll get a little more introduction to. And I really appreciated seeing the territory, just hearing how you do the territorial acknowledgement. I know that in Canada, you are significantly ahead in many, many things from your ungainly neighbor to the south. And so thank you for that. For myself, as a non-native person who lives and thinks on Kalapuya Ilahe, I also just want to acknowledge that the place where I am now with oaks near me that I can see out my window that haven't had fire on them for a long time is a traditional homeland of Kalapuya people. There were treaties between 1851 and 1855 that were part of the dispossession process here and genocide. People were moved all around what is now known as Oregon, forcibly removed to the coast and different coast reservation in different areas. Today, Kalapuya people, their descendants are members of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon. And I'm privileged to have relationships and have the opportunity to learn from a number of Kalapuya people here, part of our community in what is now known as Oregon, Eugene and University of Oregon. And, you know, for me, thinking about some of the things I heard in terms of what goes beyond territorial acknowledgement, for me, I think that the work that I want to share to you today is one of the pieces that I feel trying to step forward in what I come to understand as my relationship with colonialism, and again, as a sociologist, as a non-native sociologist. So I also want to acknowledge, my son helped me download the Native Land app, which is something that someone up your way has been a lead on, and it indicated that that your place, where many of you are listening from, is Stony, Suatina, Métis, and Cree, which is different from many of there were more peoples listed when Ken spoke. So I'm happy to know the richness of people and to learn from many people who have endured and continue to endure so much and have also so much richness, cultural and richness in terms of ecological knowledge, which I have incredibly benefited from. I am gonna turn to sharing my screen now, and there's a weird way where my program, let's see, I think I share the screen first and then, anyway, it's just a little bit weird how it works in terms of what I see, because now I want to make this full screen. Philly.
You can just go down to your right. There you go.
Isn't that it? But it wasn't going. Okay, but do you still see the title slide? Or do you see a bunch of other stuff now? I have two monitors.
Getting the main slide, and then it's showing the next slide with it.
Right.
Your
Okay,
notes
so
kind of thing.
I know, right? So I apologize for this.
Maybe use slideshow just above that.
Let's see.
Just above the Salmon title.
Instead, this one. Ooh,
there you go. Yep.
That was, thank you for teaching me that.
I'm just guessing.
I may be old, but I'm still learning. So I started working, so thinking about nature colonialism and the responsibility that I feel now to try to do something about our discipline. And those of you in Canada have really been way ahead of the United States and certainly other places as well. Aotearoa, Australia have had much more, sociologists in other places have had done a lot more work. So, but my journey began out of doing policy work that has profoundly changed my thinking and understanding. And I just have a few sort of examples of some of that work. I kind of fell into working with the Karuk tribe. I was planning, I had a postdoc at Davis and I was doing a project on herbicides and invasive species, and a number of basket weavers were really involved in the herbicide issue and have been. And yet, so I was there and was talking to people, but really the main thing that was happening was the Klamath River dam removal. And so on the bottom left was a report that we did together with my colleague Ron Reed that I'll introduce you to in just a moment. And then since then, I've now been started doing work on knowledge sovereignty on their behalf, and then their tribe's climate adaptation plan. I'm doing another project with them now on transportation adaptations. And as I was doing this, I learning, although I'm sure never fast enough. So just a little sort of where we are in the world. The inset map, Kaduk territory is in yellow, and it's just in the far northern part of California, just going into Oregon. And they are the second, they use the term tribe for themselves, second largest tribe in the state of California. And I know that, you know, lots of the legal status and cultural ways that people is different in between Canada and the United States. But in any case, the Kaduk people do not have a reservation, which has a lot of implications for them in terms of funding and sovereignty and many different issues. So I could go back really quick. I can't really do basically on the just outside of their territory on the, I wish I could show you a draw on here, but I can't. The Klamath River is a blue line that goes through the middle of the yellow area, and just to the right, to the northeast of where it's outside of their traditional territory are a series of dams. And that's the work that I first started working on with my colleague Ron Reed, who has at the time was the traditional dip net fisherman and cultural biologist for the tribe. And Ron and I did work which essentially was the first time in the United States that a tribe had claimed in a federal process that dams were giving them artificially high rates of diabetes. And it made a big impact and has continued to have a lot of effort in terms of the dam removal that we hope will be happening in just about a year and a half. Okay, let's see, why am I not able to transition slides all of a sudden? Okay, there we go. So just show a few pictures, other pictures of Ron. Ron and I have worked together with many students, including on freshwater mussels. That's the very behind at the top of the river is actually the Iron Gate Dam, which is the lowest of the dams. We worked together with other tribal folks who had did a lot of teaching for us from Umatilla people. This is David Wolf here, came down and showed us a lot. My son is he'll be 14 next week, but this is Ron holding him one of those days. And there's also a number of other folks that I've incredibly learned a great deal from. On the left here is Bill Tripp, who's now the director of the Kaduk Department of Natural Resources. On the top is Dr. Frank Lake, who is a Kaduk descendant and also a Forest Service biologist of the U.S. Forest Service. So he's both a traditional practitioner and sort of a Western trained scientist working for the agency that the Karuk tribe recognizes as occupying their territory. And on the right, so he balances many different lines. And on the right is Leif Hillman, who's the founder of the Department of Natural Resources and was its director for a long time. Also, this is Asia Conrad, who is a traditional practitioner, traditional fire practitioner, as well as she got her master's with us at University of Oregon. And then a few other folks in the front there is Ron's youngest son, Ryan Reed, in the white, and a few people over from him is Jess Conrad with a jean jacket. And this is from a photo from a panel that we took at the Native American Indigenous Studies Association a year and a half ago. It was an international panel on cultural burning that was really fun. So those are a few of the people who I have just had the incredibly profound privilege to learn from and with. So from the work I do, the policy work that is about, excuse me, the policy work is a lot of natural resource policy around the importance of fire in forest management. And I've been doing a lot of work around how in the sciences, traditional indigenous science is gaining more and more traction. And momentum, also the whole field of Native studies. Here at University of Oregon, we've renamed our ethnic studies department is now Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies. So there's been a much needed improvement in terms of the presence and representation of Indigenous peoples in so-called Western sciences. But within sociology, and especially within American sociology, it is profoundly egregious. And I honestly don't know how people stand it. I have had to, as a non-Native person where these microaggressions are not sort of directed at me, I've had so many times where my level of frustration is such that I have to leave the room. These are just a few comments from some of my colleagues sort of about the relationship of Indigenous people within sociology. And similarly, concepts such as settler colonialism. This was my first doctoral student, J.M. Bacon, had done a content analysis looking at basically that when American Indian Native peoples are present in sociological scholarship. This was done in US sociological scholarship. It was in a very pathologizing way. So not accounting for the circumstances through which people's lives might lead them to have high rates of different health disparities or use alcohol or other drugs. So I want to talk about the book that I did last year and a year and a half ago now. And because this book is essentially my attempt to make, to the extent that it makes sense, some kind of an intervention in this academic space. For a long time, since about 03 and 04, I'd been doing this natural resource policy work on behalf of the Department of Natural Resources. And one of the things that I think is so amazing is, I sort of said, I feel like I learned something new every day I was there, even though I've spent about 15 years of my life there on a regular basis. But now I have to say, I feel like I learned something new about every hour that I'm there or have any contact with the really amazing folks that I've had the opportunity to work with. And to try to think about, but all of that work was kind of done. The folks in Department of Natural Resources were guiding it. They were saying, this is what's happening. We need, this kind of a report. And for me to try to, use that information in a context that wasn't directly advocacy, that they weren't directly guiding, was a big step. But I went through tribal council several times to get permission to write the book, to do the contract, and then it was thoroughly read by multiple people. That said, the older I get, the more I'm aware of everything I don't understand. So what I want to share is my attempt, things that I have come to understand about ways that I find our discipline in need of upping our game vis-a-vis concepts of colonialism and the way that Native peoples are talked about and the things that I've learned. So I'll share a few snippets from a couple different parts of the book, but essentially I'm quite boldly having a go at, I have a love-hate relationship with sociology. And the book takes a number of parts of our discipline and sort of looks at what the theorizing has been like and shows what I believe where we can do better. So in terms of theory around race, the first chapter, theory around colonialism. Chapter 3, theory of how we understand health. Chapter 4 looks at conceptions of gender. And chapter 5 looks at conceptions of emotions. And then there's a conclusion as well where we think about climate change. And so I just want to walk us through a few examples from each of these things and try to do it in a way that's not just totally too fast or too overwhelming. And Ken, I can see you. So if you want to give me some really wild hand signals if I seem to be just going off the rails in terms of my speed. Please feel free to. It's
Okay.
just so weird on Zoom, it's like if we're talking, I can see, the audience, and I can tell if people are like, oh my gosh, lost her, like that kind of thing. So.
Okay.
So anyway, I won't talk about the first chapter, but I did just want to give a shout out to my Muskegee sociologist colleague, Dwana McKay, and my graduate student, Kirsten Vignetta, who took the lead on a paper recently around race. So the first chapter talks some about where I think we can do better as sociologists around race, but I'm not really going to talk about that. What I do want to talk about is some of the ideas around ecological violence, the idea of colonial ecological violence that J.M. Bacon talks about, and what it has to do with fire. And I did not look up to see if your community has had, what your community's relationship is with fire or any of those things. So I don't know the particular fire history in the Edmonton area, but you may or may not be aware, last year across California and Oregon, it was incredibly intense fires. And this has been the major focus of a lot of the work I've been doing. So I want to both give you a chance to hear from some of the folks I've been working with directly and introduce some of these ideas about fire. And I want to now, I may have to stop sharing in order to get out of all of this. I'm going to try doing that for a second and get back. And I apologize if this is a little clunky. And now I have you on multiple. It's so weird. Sorry, friends. Okay. Let's see. So this is just a 2-minute video that we made that is about the climate adaptation plan and the importance of Indigenous perspectives on perspectives on fire in particular. And Ken, if you can tell me heads up or not on the sound when it goes, if it needs to be more. I don't know if I can change that. But.
It's good.
Fear of fire is what brought us to this place where we are at today, where we really have reason to fear fire.
Prescribed fire can be a tool, perhaps the most powerful tool to combat the impacts of high severity fires.
We have to reestablish a positive relationship with fire. Our knowledge of this landscape and the use of fire to protect our communities, to enhance the resources that we need to survive, it's here.
People are beginning to see the benefits of prescribed fire more now than they have in a long time, over 100 years. When you see it, you realize, oh, it's going to be okay.
The more time goes on that we don't put fire back on these landscapes at the time and at the scale that we need to, then it's going to do it, not on our terms. Fire suppression has failed. Our first response has to be manage it. Not suppress it, but manage it.
So I'll quickly, let's see, I should just get back to, but now I want to share again, but not, okay, whoops. Oh, sorry. Stop sharing sound. I'm so sorry. That's the next film. And I'm not seeing where I get back to. Okay. Okay, get rid of that and then get back here. But I'm not sharing the screen.
No, nothing yet.
I'm so sorry. It's what I see on mine is, okay, now I can get back to share screen. Excuse me. And okay, go to here. And
There it comes.
okay, but what we want is to not have it, let's see, like this, but then you're seeing the wrong one. Sometimes life is not easier, right? Okay,
Just
what was the thing
go
you said?
back
I should do
to
that.
the slideshow.
Thanks so
Yeah,
much
just
for your
up from
patience.
just up from there. There you go.
Use
There.
slideshow. Okay. Okay, thanks.
It's okay.
Essentially, I'll talk a little bit about the dam removal work we did, but the fire, one of the main things that the tribe has been working on for a long time has been fire suppression and trying to return fire to the land. And as I was doing this work, it was so evident to me how colonialism is an ongoing situation. It's not just something that happened in the past. It's very much carried out today, and it's being carried out through through fire suppression policies, through outside entities dictating how and which fires will be fought, and how they'll be fought, and through language like fighting fire, through fear of fire, as Lee Philman talks about, and that the tribe was and is actively trying to use fire to return for their own cultural purposes. Fire is an incredibly important tool for taking care of the land, and yet it's been fire suppression has been completely interwoven with genocide and colonial violence. And so this, for example, is a letter from about 100 years ago from the district ranger in this community talking about that as fire suppression, the Forest Service is trying to keep all fires from happening, and that people should be shot essentially for you trying to use fire. So this kind of, when in the absence of fire, the Klamath region in particular is very much as a forest considered to be fire adapted. This is an image showing how kind of grown in it is, and it becomes impossible. The species that grow there, the food species, the cultural use species, that all of those need fire. And so people's ability to do all kinds of things is impossible. In terms of hunting, caring for the land, procuring basketry materials, all kinds of other things. So that chapter essentially is trying to make a case for our discipline of sociology, taking seriously the theory of settler colonialism as a real vector of power, of relationship between tribes and the state through the example of fire. So that's one of the things I was trying to do with this book. One of the people that I've learned a great deal from is Potawatomi philosopher Kyle Powys White, who talks about, unlike the sense that sort of there's a climate catastrophe that's brand new, that for Native peoples, the landscapes that they're inhabiting would be considered dystopic to their ancestors. So he says that living in their ancestors' dystopia now, actually, I can't, having already experienced the unraveling of the human, animal, plant, environment entanglements that were considered essential for tribal ways of life. He writes, the vast majority of our history precedes the campaigns that have established states such as the US and Canada. Our conservation and restoration efforts are motivated by how we put dystopia in perspective as just a very brief yet highly disruptive historical moment for us, at least so far. So for me, as I was trying to make sense of thinking about theorizing within sociology, how to make a case that colonialism is very much still ongoing and very much through relationships with the natural environment, Dr. White's words have been extremely useful for me. Let's see. Okay. And indeed, if we look at, a lot of these ideas of the Anthropocene and so forth, and I look at what's happening for Karuk people, the same story is the same struggle has been happening. So people have been struggling against fire suppression for over 100 years. Similarly, vis-a-vis many of the other sort of ideas of the Anthropocene is this sudden new moment in which humans are recognized as being part of the natural world. Well, that's only the case for a few. And yet the natural world is a source of power and agency, something that sociologists can and I think should take note of. And I believe all of us have a responsibility to be acting. So within US sociology, Julian Go has been doing a lot of important work on post-colonialism. He and I have gone back and forth some about, because as important as many of his concepts are, I think the term post is obviously doesn't fully address thinking about settler colonialism, but certainly this sense of certain communities, certain ways of knowing have been excluded from our discipline. And as we attend to those can be one of the most powerful ways. So throughout the book, there's a lot of interview quotes, and I'm talking, you have my own voice in there, but I have the voices of many of the people I've learned from directly in the book. And again, this sense of, it's sort of frustrating. I see, let me move you all here. Just my screen view of what I do and don't see of my own screen, pardon me. Anyway, that sociology as a discipline has very much been rooted in the sense of modernity, the ways that we think about methods and think about environmental issues have been really wrapped up in that concept of modernity, and efforts to take into account colonialism and empire are, they're there, but this is what I'm hoping to add to. Okay, what I want to do next is give 3 sort of quick examples from 3 of the other chapters of thinking about. So I guess the first one I'm introducing, sort of trying to make a stronger case for colonialism and settler colonialism specifically for our discipline. And then I did that through fire. So it was applied in a certain way, but I also, in the next couple chapters, what I do is I kind of try to develop that case through thinking about what is the theory in sociology of health and environmental health fields that are beyond sociology as well. I'm a very interdisciplinary person and member of environmental studies faculty and so forth. So through health, through gender, and then through emotions. So this is what the water looks like behind Iron Gate Dam on the Klamath River in the summer. And this is not photoshopped. This is water which it's full of microcystin, is highly toxic, both short and long-term toxins. It's a liver toxin, it can kill you. And this is also the water which my dear 20-year-old friend, who I showed you the image of before, Ryan Reed, who's one of the medicine people, drinks for 10 days during salmon ceremonies. It is a profoundly egregious and outrageous situation. And the tribe has been, and the water quality team there have been doing very powerful work. One of the reasons that dam removal is so important. I don't know if you all see me still, but I have on my desk here, I'm holding up freshwater mussel because freshwater mussels have been really important. They're very important traditional food, but they're also been an important piece in the dam policy because the Pacific Corps claimed that the dams have no downstream effects, which is absolutely absurd. But part of the way that the tribe was able to show that had to do with tissue samples from freshwater mussels, which bioaccumulate. Okay, I can get excited about this. So what I want to share is a few examples of thinking about environmental and human health. This is the first work that Ron and I started doing. When I actually learned and leaned on a bunch of work from Canadian First Nations who facing different kinds of toxins in traditional foods, the situation that Katuk people have is different. It's not about denied access because the foods are contaminated, although that is the case for the freshwater mussel at certain times of year, but it's more denied access because this dam and the other 4 dams have no fish ladders, and even fish ladders themselves are not a full fix. And so Ron, who was a cultural biologist and he and I started working together. All of the framing of the study and so forth came from his thinking and understanding. And then we went together and did interviews and did a survey. But basically that the dams have been giving people artificially high rates of diabetes and heart disease and other associated diet-related diseases. And this work has made a big impact and been really significant in the dam relicensing process. So that's Ron and one of his nephews on the left. Dipnet fishing used to be one of a very significant, about 50% of people's diet and protein forever and ever and ever until quite recently. And now Karuk people have some of the highest rates of hunger, and as well as diabetes and other things, and high use of commodity foods. So before contact, about over a pound of salmon per person per day. There are 8 different runs of fish. And then more recently, there really is not very much fish at all, not very many salmon. So this is, of course, a really big deal. And one of the things that we talked about in the report was, and looked at was, and this is some of the things, again, that influenced my work in terms of thinking within sociology, is a very interconnected view and understanding of health. So that health is about social interactions, is about the learning, is about the community. I think with COVID, so many of us are intimately aware of how our mental health and our physical health is impacted by the isolation that we experience. And one of the ways that people interact is when they're fishing the river and they go down to the falls, and it's a very important interaction site. And when people are, when there's fish being distributed, then the young people having contact with elders and all of these kinds of things. So all of this very integrated understanding of what health means is a lot of what that chapter is about. Okay, I feel like I'm just rushing through, but I want to keep going for a minute. So that was an example of health. So thinking about Indigenous perspectives being much more integrated with the natural environment and as well the different kinds of health. Another piece that, in fact, Ron talked about when we did our study, you know, it's not just about physical health, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It's about the mental health, and that's what I'll close with here. And I'm not closing it, but when I sort of talk in terms of moving through this. Another piece that we were working on is as we were going around and doing interviews, talking to fishermen about the lack of salmon and what it meant. By the way, Ron started working on this part because he lost his mother and his 2 aunts while he was, and that's him on the right of the 2 fishermen there, as he was working on the relicensing process. And this, you know, put a whole level of urgency in terms of that elders are dying too young because they don't have access to the right food. And as we were going around and doing this, he's like, this is about gender too. This is about masculinity. This is about how young men come to understand themselves as men. And so we did and put not into the original policy report, but this became an article and then later became a book chapter around gender, about the relationship between masculinity and the access to fish. And so the title of that is, you know, what happens to Karuk masculinity when there are no fish. As I was working on it, another wonderful Karuk person, staff in the Department of Natural Resources, who's a weaver and female identified person. She's like, she was reading the book, was almost ready to go to print. And she's like, you cannot not talk about women. And this is about femininity too. And I said, well, that's great, but I don't have any of information on that. So I can't write about something. And maybe we could do that as a different project another time. Because at this point I had been working on the book for over 10 years and that was not the right answer. And so she assisted me in finding a number of women who were willing to speak to me. And we put together a whole bunch of material about gender, femininity and how constructions of femininity were linked. And so, yeah, so thinking about, and I had worked some with weavers like Laverne Glaze, who's pictured here with her huckleberries and her huckleberry basket. So this is, I think, one of the chapters that I'm most excited about, in that I think that the thinking, from what I understand, the thinking in Native communities around gender is really different, but so exciting compared to the theorizing within sociology. Non-Native sociology, I think, can learn a lot from Indigenous feminist perspectives. Essentially, I'll say that. And it is my hope that the work I've done and the particular voices that people have and the stories that they share can help move that thinking forward. Obviously, gender is a very difficult thing to talk about. Anything about gender, race, power, there's a lot at stake, and many people, we all have different understandings and different relationships to that material. Myself as a non-Native person, I'm hoping that the ideas I put forward here are useful. But essentially in this chapter, I talk about how gender constructions have been really intimately interwoven with ecological activities, with ecological responsibilities across North America for a very, very long time and continue to be, and that it is through settler colonialism that has disrupted those gender constructions, gender identities, and also through many different ways. And one of those ways is through relationships with the natural environment. So land management policies that criminalize Karic activities like burning the forest or meta habitat, fishing, gathering, hunting in a traditional manner are powerful disruptions to the possible realm of individual and collective gender identities. That colonialism is being enacted today through fire policy in particular, and through many other ways, through ecological violence that is also very gendered. And I think I opened the chapter of the book with this quote. I have to keep moving my little thing around that sees some voices so that I can read it. That for nearly all of North American history, gender constructions have looked very different than they do today. By all accounts, the diverse Indigenous notions of gender that organize human communities in the place from which I wrote on the Klamath stand now in Kalapuya land across what is now called California or the United States or Canada, Mexico, have long been more fluid, less binary, and organized around caring and stewardship rather than hierarchy and domination. This forced alteration of the gender structure was so necessary to material access to resources and symbolic normalization of the new order of settler colonial order that without it, what we know as California could not exist. This process through which gender has been forcibly reorganized has had everything to do with the natural world. Not only did it take place for the explicit purpose of settler access to Indigenous lands, the process through which it occurred relied upon tautological binaries of mutual associations between gender and nature for its symbolic construction. It requires that people believe both a gender binary and a nature culture binary were real. So that's something that I just put forward as like a, as put forward. Now I'm trying to go back to that, but instead I'm going, oh, this is so annoying. I'm so sorry. Okay, there we go. Put forward, food for thought or whatever in terms of the literature within sociology and gender and Native studies and gender. I feel like my sense is that I've been speaking for a while. I could say a few things about emotions and close there, or we could sort of close here because I have, I'd be interested in people's sense of attention.
I think you could probably, for the next few minutes, talk about that last piece on emotions. I think that would be fine.
Okay, we'll do that, and then
we have till 4:30, so we have still about 40 minutes for discussion and questions.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that check-in. It's so hard to tell as I stand here in my office all alone in my little box, and you all are in your little boxes. Just, there's not a lot of back and forth with eye contact or things like that. So thank you, Ken, for that. So the last sort of content piece that I'll speak about, and this is Dr. Davidson there does such incredibly important work on emotions. So I was really delighted to see you and have a little exchange with you. Has to do with how we think about emotions. And my first book as well looks at emotions and power and culture, and how emotions both are part of social change, but as well, part of the glue that keeps us together. And I think just emotions are really good stuff in terms of for sociologists to look at. And so did my friend Ron, my colleague, in terms of thinking about health. And so as we were doing, the work, the interviews around the dams and what it meant, the disappearance of fish meant, he was saying, this is not just about our physical health. It's not just about diabetes rates. This also is about our emotional health. And so that work a little bit went into the policy document, but did become an article and then later a chapter in the book. So I'll just say a couple things about the interventions or the additions I hope to make there. The chapter I titled sort of the emotional impacts of environmental decline. What can native cosmologies teach sociology about emotions and environmental justice? We are starting to see more and more people think about emotions as part of environmental justice. But again, I'm in general very interested in the relationship between emotions that we think of as something so personal and culture and social power, and how we experience the world, how we understand the world. This particular image that you have on the left there is something that I've never heard Kari or York person speak about without them being really devastated with grief. It happened the year before I was there, although there are fish kills that happen every year. Usually they're juvenile fish kills. In 2001, the water was shut off to the lower Klamath at a year that there was a particularly large run coming up, and 68,000 adult salmon died from warm temperatures that spread a disease very rapidly. They lined, as you see here, this was for miles and miles coming up the river. So these fish were returning to spawn, and they died. And for many people had just come out of ceremonies, and they came out of ceremonies to this. And so there's just a whole, really a lot of trauma around this issue. And it has also been a part of motivation for the dam. So in this chapter, I talk about how emotions serve as a signal function that tell us as individuals, in this case, grief, a sense of powerlessness that people experience, a sense that genocide is ongoing now, that colonialism is ongoing now. And it's through those emotions is part of how that happens, and that sociologists can theorize that and need to pay attention to it. And so this is, one of the more theoretical things I'll offer and sort of leave you with. But we looked at 4 different emotions: grief, anger, shame, and hopelessness, and talk about how those are connected to sense of identity, sense of social interactions, and then connection to social structure. So identity in terms of grief, it's like tearing the person's heart out. The lack of social interactions, that sense of sadness because people aren't interacting down at the falls where they go to fish. And again, that sense that Kari people could disappear in genocide. And there's, of course, all kinds of stories about, when the deer come down to the river, then Kari people will disappear, or different kinds of things like that. So that sense of one's relationship in a social structure. Okay, I think what I want to do is stop screen sharing for just a second and then go to a closing slide, or else I'm not sure what to do, but I think I had a couple more slides, but I want to move to questions there. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Kari. So we now have time. We have until half past the hour, 4:30 Edmonton Mountain Standard Time. If you have any questions, and you can use the raise hand function under reactions at the bottom of your screen, or you can post a question in the chat section. I think it's preferable that if you have a question that you turn on your video if you can, if it's possible, and ask Kari the question as face to face as possible as we can. But if you're uncomfortable with that, or you're more comfortable with using the chat function, I'll keep track of that and I can read those questions out as well. Okay. So I think there's Kari talked about a number of chapters in the book that I just finished reading, and I know a number of you have actually read it as well. So I think the questions can maybe ask something related to some of the material that she covers in those chapters, or whatever you wish. Deborah, you have a question.
I can't believe I was up first. Thanks for recognizing me, Ken, and hi, Kari, and so lovely to hear your personal take on your work here. You probably won't be surprised. I want to ask you a question about emotions, and it struck me in your presentation something that I'm hoping I can convey here. There's been so much attention recently, probably more in the popular press than in the academic press, to eco anxiety. This increasing anxiety around climate change and its implications. And my sense is that in our Western cultures, we aren't even able to really articulate that anxiety. Like, we feel like something is wrong, but we don't have the language to articulate it because we've been so severed from our relationship to nature for so long. And then on top of that, we don't even really know what to do about that. How to work through it, how to process it. And I'm thinking that this is, yet another place where there's so much to learn from Indigenous cultures, not only in just being able to articulate that anxiety, but also how to process it, how to work through that. And I'm just wondering if maybe you can speak to that a little bit in terms of what you see in the maybe I hate to use the term emotional intelligence, but the emotional intelligence that perhaps might might be more prevalent in Indigenous cultures to deal with eco anxiety.
You're the best, Deborah. You just did that to me. I was like afraid, because Dr. Davidson is such an important theorist. You're going to ask me something that's like completely that I won't be able to have the reference for off the top of my head. But you've asked me something that I would have spoken about had I not tried to pack too much into this time. You probably did that on purpose. Thank you. It's great to see you. I think that there is a huge amount. I mean, one of the things, so, for those of you that may know, my first book, really was about this sense of, I link it to environmental privilege, as Deborah notes, but this sense of eco anxiety, and this sense of, the emotions of guilt and fear and helplessness are really paralyzing people, together with cultural contexts in which we don't talk about what we can really do, and a political economic context in which our societies are organized around fossil fuels, which makes it very difficult also to imagine beyond the world as it is. And so, that was a big part of my intellectual work for a long, long time. And then, this project came along. It's extremely different. I mean, I really was, although I actually wrote Living in Denial at the same time as I was doing the work with Ron on the Klamath, it, extremely different kind of work. And for a long time, I felt very, I don't know what, scattered or something, or just like I had different parts of myself, which I'm sure a lot of us feel at different times. But at some point I began putting them side by side, like many of us, certainly Idle No More is a big moment when it's pretty freaking clear that Indigenous people are not as, and since then Standing Rock and so many other things are not as sort of frozen in this amorphous eco-anxiety. And so as a sociologist, we have to think about what is going on. And one of the things that I talk about, so I talk about this a little bit in the conclusion of the book, actually, and started putting things together. And there's a couple articles where I've done that together with one of my graduate students as well. Looking at what is it about environmental privilege that's so different in sort of non-native settler communities, that's so different from the folks I work with on the Klamath who are so mobilized around climate change. And I think part of it has to do with this piece from Kyle White about this is not new, that for many of us that were raised in the modernist, the world is going to get better and better and have benefited from the modern project. It's like, bam, the wave just knocked you out of your spot. But for people who have long been very aware that this modern project is built on all kinds of house of cards and have not benefited from it, it doesn't look quite like that. And so one thing I talk about, I guess, I'm not sure if I'll be able to answer this fully, and you can maybe ask it again, but I'm just going to screen share for a second, one more time, and share a couple slides that and I'm just going to let you be there. That's imperfect, but with this idea of imagination and what we can imagine, and you alluded as well to the sense of alienation that people, that non-native, that all of us have under the world that we're in, but that non-native people have particularly maybe had more generations of it, that we don't imagine how we are connected actually to the natural world. So we see this in sociology where so much of the discipline does not draw upon anything in the natural world to explain things. And people refer to Durkheim's social facts and so forth. So that we need to have this ecological imagination. And shoot, I guess you see a bunch of funny stuff rather than get rid of that. Clean it up for, that's not working, sorry. That we need to be able to see the relationships. We also, as sociologists, know that most people look at society without understanding how we are embedded in it. And so one of my favorite terms is Mill's concept of the sociological imagination, to be able to understand both our limitations by culture, by social structure, but also our effectiveness, our ability to affect change. And so I think that part of why we are so frozen, for those of us who have environmental privilege in a sense of being frozen and have this very amorphous sense of what's going on, is that the house of cards, the myth that we are separate from one another. I mean, COVID has done a lot to make it really clear that we are very connected. In our community, we have one of the highest rates of homelessness in the nation here in Eugene, Oregon. People cannot protect themselves from COVID if they can't even protect themselves from, from the elements. And so this makes all of us less safe, right? This is like one of the myths that many other people have written about as well, the myths of our separateness. Similarly, with the natural environment, climate change is bringing it home, but in ways that are often hard to understand, that it has never been true that we're separate. So I don't know if that quite gets there, but I think that's why it's so amorphous. And then similarly, for native peoples, there's instead of that sense of like, I'm an independent agent and I don't have to listen to my family, I'm going to get as far away from them as I can. My native friends are, they're telling each other what to do. One of my friends, if you're native, people are always telling you what to do. Like, it's not just, and so they're saying, you got to go do this. You got to go to this rally. You got to do this thing. You got to take care of your community. You got to go do this. And so there are also traditional practices about how to be responsible. So that are very different from what I was raised with, of like, oh, you're on your own. So
Great.
that's mine.
Thanks, Deborah. Thanks, Kari. Okay, next up for questions, John Parkins.
Hi, Kari. John Parkins here. I think we've met once, maybe a long time ago. when we used to travel the planet. It's nice to see you. And I've been enjoying your book, so I've got my own copy.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate a lot of the ideas there. I really took away this sense of urgency to take processes of colonialism more seriously, ongoing processes, not something historical, but something real and present, and something distinct from, the way that sociology has been traditionally been approaching these issues. And I was really interested in your work on fire. We in the Edmonton area in Alberta, we also have a fire landscape. Fire is a natural part of the ecosystem here. So we have very similar kinds of challenges and opportunities to work with Indigenous communities around decolonizing our fire management practices. But I wanted to ask you maybe more specifically about gender. And I felt like that chapter on gender in particular was quite challenging to sociology, because it was trying to kind of resituate the idea of, the social construction of gender within a material reality. And that seems to be, kind of the opposite direction to what most of the social sciences are going these days. And I guess I'm wondering, what kind of reaction you've been getting. Maybe my general question is, what's the reaction you're getting from the sociology community? Because it seems like the book in a way is just a direct challenge to sociology. And what have sociologists been saying? How have they been responding to the book in general?
Thank you so much for that question. And I'm thrilled to know about the fire ecology up there. And I guess I was just like rushing from one thing to the next today, and I didn't get a chance to look up your fire story there. So, and I also really appreciate, and it's nice to see you. I really appreciate your question on gender. This is the chapter where I feel like, some of the graduate students of mine that have read it who are non-native have been a bit upset with me about it, about that some of the language I use maybe hasn't been careful enough. I am, gender has been central to my thinking for, since before I entered sociology, but I'm not as up on all of the way what feminist sociologists are doing, although it's been kind of always there. And so I think, some of I perhaps could have been more careful in some of how I phrase things, but at the same time, I have been incredibly unimpressed and frustrated with a lot of what feminist sociologists has done and gone. And so this is partly why I moved away. And there are several tensions in this chapter that are big. And as you note, they are sort of around ideas of materiality, and then also around ideas of essentialism, and so especially essentialism around the concepts of tradition and traditional roles. And these are areas where, to the best I understand it, as a non-native sociologist who doesn't spend as much time reading feminist sociology of gender as I've read fire ecology for the last 10 years. I want to make an offering. I want to make some bridging here. I want to move our thinking forward, and I may not be the best person to do it because of some of the ways that, but one of the things, and so there's been some reaction, but I wish I would like to have more, I guess. I think that I've been very provocative, I think, in the book, in the whole. It's some measure of arrogance to assume that I could try to speak to so many different subdisciplines and have, to do it in a way that's thoughtful. But for sure, vis-a-vis both those pieces in terms of materiality, one of the things I really hope that my use of voices, of people's actual own words, Katuk people's voices to do this, is at least something that cannot be negated. And I think that specifically the piece is like, okay, whatever you think as a sociologist about how materiality does or doesn't shape the social world. I think it absolutely does. I think the natural world absolutely does. It is also absolutely interconnected with the social meaning that we make of it, whether it's the social meaning that we make of lead poisoning. There is still something real about lead poisoning that needs to be dealt with. And similarly, for weavers who cannot access certain plants, it is a form of gendered violence. The material world, or for young men who cannot go fishing and bring fish to the other, it is a form of gendered violence, and it can't just be replaced with something else. And I hope that people's voices will be a way of at least, okay, that can't be just washed away. And then similarly, I think another real touching point is this has to do, with ideas around gender binaries. I mean, the area within feminist theory and popular culture in general that I think is most exciting is how we're moving away from gender binaries and thinking like all of what we've thought of as gender is about power and colonialism. And I think it's a lot about colonialism specifically. And yet what my Kadu colleagues, they use these ideas of male and female at the same time as it looks different and it's not in the same ways, but they do, have more traditional concepts of what women and men can do. And there's times when those can be interrupted, but there's also more of a fixedness to it. So I think those are some of the things that non-native feminists who are pushing against gender binary find problematic. But I think there's an importance of trying to listen to what the feminist sociologists the indigenous feminists have to say about that, and not just dismiss it because it doesn't fit what they've been looking at.
Right. Great. Thanks, Kari. Nice to hear you, and thanks for your responses to my question.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you for asking that question, and it's great to see you too. Yeah.
All right. Thanks. So our next question is from Angeline.
Thank you. I realized as you were speaking to the rest of John's question that you already spoke a little bit about this, but I'd love to know a little bit more about how you navigate gender identity in sort of these non-Western Indigenous contexts. I think it can be really hard as Western trained sociologists to move beyond feminist sociology and kind of those what we are taught is the more progressive way, I guess, of doing sociology. So really, like, how do you resist that feminist sociology and sort of move beyond some of these maybe more problematic assumptions and norms? And I mean, you spoke a little bit about how you like to use other people's voices, but when you get then to the more, I guess, like analysis part, how do you ensure that that's not lost? It's one thing to quote someone, but how do you as a Western researcher really kind of take this and utilize it in a meaningful and in a way that really honors the people that originally spoke to it?
Thank you so much. It's such a thoughtfully worded question too. I think that my one-word answer is we have to have humility. I mean, as I said, there is so much that I do not understand. And again, I've spent more time reading fire ecology than feminist sociology recently. And so that limits my ability to be a intermediary between the kind of analyses and critiques of power that are happening in that community versus the kinds of analyses and critiques of power that are happening from the Karuk folks that I know and I'm in contact with. And so I think essentially my main, I feel like Indigenous conceptions of gender and linking colonialism, linking all of it with colonialism is the most powerful, most radical thing we can do, in part just from like a timeline perspective. Like what other sociologists are trying to respond to is in the context of things that have happened since then. And so if we think about that, in order for colonialism to be happening, that effort was a forcible reorganization of gender constructions, gender structure, very much about accessing land, very much about disrupting Indigenous societies in order to do that. So the ways and relationships and struggles that people have had with gender construction since then are happening in that context. And so if it's as a non-native white 20-year-old brilliant graduate student that I have learned a great deal from in one of my classes last year, the things that they are grappling with, the way that they look at what my Karuk colleagues and friends talk about in terms of traditional gender, it looks really offensive to that person. But they just are coming from very, very different standpoints. And I think that the main thing is that I think that the indigenous understanding of the colonialism and gender, that the gender has been so reorganized by colonialism is a big picture piece that other feminists would do well to learn from and listen to. And it's far be it from me to know how to navigate or untangle those parts, but I guess that's, I think if all of us are trying to think about how do we have full lives, live, respect, power, grace, survival, love, all those things, that there is being in conversation with each other is a way forward.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I just checking to see if there's any more questions. Maybe what I'll do is I'll read a comment which will lead to a question I have, and darn, someone's going to jump ahead of me. So I have a question. I'll come back to the comment, but Juan has a question.
Yeah, sorry, just to follow up to the last question. Thank you so much. I guess I'm wondering, a lot of the discussion so far is really about kind of moving away from always just thinking about Western knowledge and implementing different types of knowledges. But I'm wondering, I guess bringing in this idea of like emotion and psyche, even like beyond knowledge, how can settler scholars and Western scholars change or aim to transform themselves with relationship to not just the knowledge, but their role as settlers?
Yeah, it's super, super important. And that is a question at hand, I think, for many of us who, for myself, I think when I think about that question, I think about one of the things that seems really apparent is, and one of sort of the reference points for me as someone that identifies as female and white and lives in the United States is like that, the women's movement that I identified with, was doing all this work. And a lot of the men were like, kind of like, whoa, like they were in reaction to, and I think that there's been I think there's a little bit of a parallel in what I see happening now, like in Indigenous studies, there's so much incredible, rich work. And for those of us that identify as non-Native, we have a lot to do, and we're really in a early stage with it. And so it's, and I think in Canada, you all have done so much more around settler responsibility and, those kinds of things, but unraveling, I think it's, survival is at stake for this. And the work to be done there is the most wonderful work, because so much of the boxes that settlers have been put into in order to receive and play the position that we've played in this social structure have not been good for us either. I mean, they've been good in maybe certain material ways, but not necessarily good in emotional ways. So, we mentioned the idea of individualism earlier. It's a pretty screwed up thing. And now with COVID, we're really realizing, hey, this is not good for our mental health, and has no relationship to how we actually are as social beings. So thinking about, like I definitely doing work on one's own family history, what is each of our story of how our families came to be where they are, to think how they do, to understand the world that way, what healing needs to be done in one's own family story, healing of trauma that people carry and thus are able, this is not necessarily super theoretical, but I think it's very connected. And then, as sociologists, there's wonderful things in the discipline of sociology. I love the thinking about power and class and race, and I love a lot of the thinking about gender, but a lot of it is just limited. And so it can be really expanded by interrogating, what would it look like if whatever particular theory conceptualized settler colonialism in it, how do indigenous sciences and social sciences and indigenous ideas of the world, how do they reshape and reframe what a sociological analysis of power has looked like? So I don't know if that's my answer. Thank you for that question, Juan.
Great, thank you. So Kira has a question. This is great. Everyone's coming through and you're preventing me from asking my question, but that's great. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. It's really wonderful to see your work being put forward. I do have a question about your relationship, I suppose, with the policy around fire management, and through your work, how you've seen Indigenous knowledge incorporated into policy, and whether it's been possible to center it without co-opting or cherry picking.
That's awesome. Thank you for your attentiveness to that issue that informs the question. So, the work I've been doing is it's been on behalf of the tribe. I can put, if I can do it without, I can put into the website, well, I'll put this one video link since it's up into the chat, but then I was going to put in the climate change projects website. So the Kuduk tribe is very much at the lead of a lot of fire management. I am insanely privileged to be able to work with people who are very actively trying to get, Kuduk people who are actively trying to get fire back on the land. In this particular community in Northern California, there are a lot of non-native settlers who've had multi-generational relationships with Kuduk friends and family, and are also working alongside. So there's the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership, which I'll put in the chat also, which is a Indigenous, non-Indigenous alliance formed by Bill Tripp and another non-native guy named Will Harling, who Bill Tripp is a traditional fire practitioner and the lead for the Karuk DNR right now. So the way that co-opting, so the tribe is very much at the heart of this. The way that co-opting does come in on the Klamath in that area in Northern California, the way that co-opting for sure comes into place though is right now, I'm the only one on your screen. A week from tomorrow, I'll be doing a talk with Ron Reed called Fire is Food, where we'll talk more, I think, for sociologists and sociological audience. It felt fine for me to go forward being the one to speak. Ron is not a sociologist or an academic, although as a sociologist, I've learned a great deal from him. But it's very easy to keep reaching out to the non-native folks who work with the tribe, to the entities, the agencies. I think that there's on the Klamath and Kuduk folks through the Western Partnership, there are some pretty savvy non-native allies in dozens of them. And I think that makes a difference, but it is a continual issue. And in that particular area, the tribe is a real force and that makes a difference. But yeah, thank you for your question.
Great, thanks, Kira.
Thank you.
Next, yeah, we have Luke. Go ahead.
Great, thanks very much, Ken, and thanks, Dr. Norgaard, for your awesome presentation. It seems like you have brought forward this I guess, critique or sympathetic critique of sociology for, in many ways, forgetting to or not bringing in the environment and the natural world into our conceptions of race and gender and different sort of theoretical concepts that we address. And I'm curious about what your sociological explanation for that might be. Because, yeah, is it a matter of us sort of starting to do that? Or like, I'm thinking about kind of the university as an institution and this kind of placeless sort of way it's been formed of traveling scholars and knowledge. And yeah, like, I'm thinking, yeah, rethinking what the university means and how it relates to its surrounding lands, or anything else that you might think of in relation to that explanation.
Great. Oh, that's a beautiful question. Thank you. I mean, I think sociology, different disciplines have had their relationship with colonialism. So anthropology, of course, had very explicit extractive relationships on behalf of, the state vis-a-vis indigenous peoples, and this very explicit, overt idea of hierarchy, and then anthropology as a field has really undergone a revolution, and maybe not complete enough. But there has really been a rethinking. And then other disciplines like geography have come, as this interdisciplinary space that's come more recently and is not as, I think it's been much easier to integrate the concept that the natural world matters and so forth, and that maybe indigenous perspectives as well. Sociology, unlike anthropology, originally was this discipline for the study of this wholly new concept of urbanization and this new thing that was happening, this new human experience that was happening, this modern project. And so it was developed at a time when there was the belief that we humans had overcome the natural world, that white people were explicitly superior to indigenous peoples, that this was, again, this trajectory of modernization. Technology is going to protect people from the raw power of nature and all of this stuff. And so I think sociology has not had really its epistemic insurgents. And, people like Julian Go, and, there's people who do post-colonial sociology, but there has not been, but that's different than really reckoning on the whole with the discipline. I mean, it does deal with it some, but, the field of environmental sociology has very much been considered periphery and not, at the base of things. So actually, when I first started working on this book, I had just begun working for the Kodak tribe, and I thought it was going to be more of a book about environment and how the environment mattered for race and gender and all these things. And then as I was working more and more through Department of Natural Resources and doing all this policy work, I'm like, oh, it's about colonialism. And lo and behold, colonialism and the environment intimately interconnected. So that's, I think it has to do with we are long overdue for a real, looking at ourselves as sociologists. That's my answer.
Thank you. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Luke. Okay, so we're getting near the end of our time with Kari, and I don't see any hands coming up. Therefore, that means I get to ask my question finally. So there's a comment in the chat section that forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. Amy makes a comment about she appreciated the talk and how you stated to manage fire rather than suppressing it, especially because we have been suffering through so many fires in BC in the last few years, which have really affected, among other important life elements, things like air quality. And so I think that's a great comment. And it also leads into the question I have, is that my own background as a forester, interestingly enough, and experience with fire management in the Northwest Territories, especially around prescribed burning or managed burning. So I have this interest in sort of what the Karuk are doing as well around managing fire and Karuk fire management, I guess. So I think the question I would like to know is more of a practice question: is have the the practices of the Karuk people around fire management in protecting and maintaining the health and ecology of oak forests or trees and acorns, as you write about. Has that influence, or what has the influence been on whether Northern California or Oregon state level prescribed burning practices or fire management more broadly?
Thank you so much. There's so much in this question, and certainly also around smoke. And I just put into the chat, the Karuk tribe have a media channel on YouTube. There's a number of folks in the community that do media work. And so there's a lot of specific, there's a ton of more information on that. So I'll just put that in there. So there's, smoke policy, air quality policies. There's all kinds of stuff around, like, to set a fire is considered like this action for which you have to go through regulatory approval because it's considered a non, it's not acknowledged that human ignitions are part of how that ecosystem evolved. It's considered like an outside thing for which you have to take an action. As though you were building a dam or something like that. So there are lots and lots of regulations that interfere with the tribe's ability to use fire in the ways that they often do anyway. People actually just are setting fires still as an issue of sovereignty. But the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership has a number of projects actually on that other link. If people want to look at that, you can see most of them are smaller projects, but they are actively burning every year. It's just maybe 2% of what they'd like to be burning. And often it has, smoke regulations, one of the things, this is a whole topic that, we don't really have time for, but I'd be happy if anyone wants to email me any of it. And in the Karuk Climate Adaptation Plan, there is a bit about smoke, but smoke is also an environmental justice issue because we cannot just, smoke is of course, dangerous for us. It has physical health, mental health. It's for elders, for people with respiratory health. Smoke is a real issue. And yet we actually cannot have a totally smoke excluded world any more than we can have a fire excluded world. And so when fire management happens in a way that's sort of based on this like assumption that it could actually be kept entirely at bay, what happens is fire and smoke happen in less predictable times, and they happen in longer periods and more intense periods in certain communities. And so anyway, I could say more about that, but for sure, people are getting fire on the land. They do fire trainings every year, 2-week-long fire training programs at the Karuk tribe. The Yurok tribe also has one where they're training other people how to do prescribed fire. There's a specific fire crew that's Karuk led, which responds in ways, whenever possible. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. So I think, look at that, we are right on time to end. So that was perfect. I want to thank everybody for attending, and also I really appreciate how you've engaged with Kari and have your cameras on. I mean, it's, I can't always ask that, but I think it's really quite nice to try to humanize a very dehumanizing sometimes tool like Zoom. So I would just like to, before I thank Kari, is just to let you know about a Sustainability Council lecture series talk that's coming up on March 10th. This is by Dr. Pearl-Ann Reichwein at 12:30 p.m. entitled The Banff School of Fine Arts and the Public University. So you could visit the Sustainability Council website for those details. I couldn't put that slide up just because we don't really have enough time for that. So finally, thank you all for joining us, and please join me in any way you can in thanking our wonderful speaker, Dr. Kari Norgaard, for her really wonderful talk today. Great.
Thank you so much. It's really, what a delightful group you are. What a great intellectual community. And thanks for all those really spot on questions and the work that you all are doing. And Ken, thank you. That was awesome to be able to have a little contact with you. Finally, it was a long time coming. So you were persistent.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks again, Kari.
Yeah, thank you.